Yeah, one of the approaches that people are using now in neuroscience is the idea that different modalities there's different statistics of the input. So that if you analyze the statistics of the input for the auditory system, they're just very different from those of the visual system or something else. And it's actually gone a step further, as I'm sure you know, by the Sonicelli at NYU. And he's a psychologist who's actually got statistics of the input for several different kinds of sounds, like gurgling water, tearing of papers. And you can just give a statistical analysis of that and then present that directly to the auditory system and see what happens. And it turns out that you get the auditory signal in the animal when you do that. So I think that this sort of works so beautifully with your story. That is, that we don't have to get terribly mystical about the fact that there are differences in the modalities, because it really looks like that's going to be a story in terms of the differences in the statistics of the input. And that pretty much, and there isn't too much, as it were, left over. So when you put that account into your much broader framework of predictive models, it all kind of hangs together.
I think that's right, and that's kind of the way that I would want to address the worry that Keith was raising towards the end there, which was something like, you know, what resources, if any, do you have here to reconstruct modality-specific differences, given that you've also got in the predictive coding story very abstract encodings at the higher level that make predictions across all of the modalities. So all of the kind of Gibsonian stuff about, you know, our grip on the world really being constantly multimodal rather than ever in a single modality, that seems right. All of the, you know, the high-level hidden causes that you mix together to predict the sensory barrage are being mixed to predict the sensory barrage across all of the currently available sensing. So you need to somehow do this trick of having both things at once, but because there are very distinctive signatures for distinctive states of affairs available in each of the kind of, you know, auditory, visual, tactile modalities, I think you can get both. So yeah, I'll just buy that wholesale. It seems like just the right thing to add. Was that, yeah, sorry?
I don't buy that also. I think, I mean, I love your stuff, and as you know, but I don't think you can get away with saying that to get the contents and you've got the phenomenal consciousness along with it. And the kind of thing which makes trouble for you, I think, are, for example, experiments on sensory substitution, where we know that you can actually use, let's say, the skin or the ears, for that matter, to take in the statistical information that Pat is talking about, which will be associated with vision, for example, and nonetheless the phenomenology, the feel of it, is appropriate to the sense organs which are involved in receiving the information. I mean, skin vision feels like touch, even if it gives you access to the contents of the spatial visual world. Voice system to replace blindness feels like sound. Again, people like Alvanoe and so on, they claim it's not so, but they actually haven't bothered to read the protocols of the people who are wearing these things and see what they say. They insist that the quality remains appropriate to the nature of the actual sense organ which is being used. But equally, so that's the case where you've got the content with the wrong phenomenology in a way. But equally, we know that in cases of blind sight, but if I was here, I'd show you a film of, I mean, I have it with me, I have it actually, a film of my monkey Helen running around the visual, astonishing access to content of the visual world, being able to pick up peanuts, run up and take things from my hand and so on, avoid obstacles. There's every reason to think there was no consciousness present, because we know the analogy with later cases of blind-sighted humans that they, at least insofar as they can, it's never as good at the actual access to the contents as this monkey was. Nonetheless, they say there's nothing like to be it. So here's a case where you've got the content and the consciousness hasn't just fallen out of it. So that's why, in the end, I think I think there's a lot in your story, but I think it still leaves this extra question hanging over us. We haven't explained phenomenal content yet.
So those are fantastic questions, and I think they put pressure on this story at just the right places to move discussion on. On the visual substitution or the general sensory substitution stuff, so I have done some work on that. You know, I had a little project with the Open University for a few years where we were implementing some of those systems. We had a little sort of a kind of belly touch kind of system. And I think that what you're getting there are really saliency effects. So it's something like you can, if you want, attend to the touch aspects. And I certainly could when I was strapped up to these things. I maybe didn't wear them as long as I should have, but you know, I kept trying. And I did get to the point where I could play table tennis, you know, with a blindfold on using the touch sensor. Not very well, but I could find a ball. So I guess the kind of thought that I would want to have there is you're still being put in touch with a distal realm. You're still mixing hidden causes to explain the sensory barrage that is presenting this distal realm to you. But according to the task you're engaged in, whether it really is just dealing with the table tennis or whether it's, for example, answering questions about whether there's any touch involved when you're dealing with the table tennis, you up the value of different bits of the prediction error signal differently, and so under some conditions you get to experience the touch more than you do under other conditions.
You don't get experience of phenomenal whiteness or blackness.
No, you don't. No, you're not getting that sort of information. So, you know, well.
But that's partly because of the way that the external receptors filter information. So the real test of the statistics of the input story is the one that Tony Mawsham, as a neuroscientist, is using, where you bypass the retina altogether and you stimulate the neurons in V1 directly. And then it turns out that the responses are pretty much what you would expect for, say, visual motion in MT. So I think that the substitution story is not quite as important as it might seem, because as you know, I mean, in the retina, there's just this huge amount of information processing that's done long before you even get to the ganglion cells. And it's a filter. So you're filtering out all kinds of stuff, thereby changing the statistics of the input. And so I think it's not the best, maybe, test of this idea.
Well, there's a lot to, so that seems like there's something about the richness of the pre-processor that's required to make the correct kind of use of this. There's some Santa Barbara people that have been working on that I was chatting to. So they think that full-on sensory substitution probably is possible, but you need a very, very fancy bit of kind of front-end pre-processing before you get the stuff through it. But the other question that you raised, which I think probably a more kind of philosophically probative question about Helen the monkey. So this is, I think this does get to the heart of the issue. What I want to say about Helen, or about any cases like that, is that even though they're successfully negotiating their environment at the short time scale, they don't actually know what they can do in the environment. So there's a certain sense in which if you kind of stopped Helen in mid-go and were able to ask her a few questions, you're going to be a fancy monkey now, you know, and say, you know, on the basis of your current state, what actions can you perform? I think, in fact, there's a lack of knowledge there. And it's that disconnect that means that Helen isn't, if you like, being set up for the kind of qualitative experience or qualitative puzzlement that we ourselves have. It's the same kind of thing that I'd want to say about DF. So that whole kind of range of cases, I think there's an ability to use the sensory signal to do stuff, but it's not delivering knowledge of the action space that you're poised over. And in that sense, it's falling short of the qualitative, of presenting an apparently qualitative realm to us. So that's kind of what I want to say.
And there's actually one important datum in Nick's film, which I may have them on my laptop. There's only one anomalous bit of behavior. I mean, Nick and I showed that film to a bunch of people, including some eminent primatologists. We showed the Nick's film without introduction. And can you say if there's anything wrong with this monkey? And the only thing that nobody said, well, she's blind. Nobody said that because she was obviously being visually guided. But there was one thing she did which was anomalous and puzzling. If Nick threw raisins down on the floor, the white floor, she went and picked them up, boom, 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 and put them in her mouth just as fast as she could possibly do. But then, clever variation, he put little bits of black sticky tape down on the floor, and she went for them like raisins. Nothing came in, and she perseverated. And that perseveration, I think, is exactly the sort of thing you're saying. Look, she doesn't know the space. She doesn't know how to go on. She keeps being fooled by this little piece of black sticky tape, which is what you would want to happen on this story.
Well,
but do you know whether a control monkey does the same thing?
No.
But I do know that DF has things that are a bit like that. So I got to meet DF through Rob McIntosh at some point. DF is a famous carbon monoxide poison patient who has a kind of visual form agnosia, so she can't name the objects in front of her. She says she doesn't see the objects as kind of shaped cups, etc. But she can do all kinds of cool stuff, like reaching out and picking up cups. We went for a coffee together, and she could walk across and order new coffee at the coffee bar and bring it back. But if you show her a shape, put a shape in front of her and ask her whether she can reach out and grip that shape, she doesn't know the answer to that question, because there are some shapes she can grip and some that she can't. So she's learned over time that she's fluent at picking up most things. But if you put something rather unusually shaped in front of her, she's also learned that she wouldn't be able to do that. And so she actually now knows that she doesn't know whether she can successfully reach out and grip an object in front of her. But I guess what I'm trying to get at in all this slightly nebulous stuff about direct non-inferential knowing in the little Access Qualia paper was something like that. It's our knowledge about what we can do, which is kind of presented in a format apt for reasoning and planning about what we can do. So I kind of think that there are real ties to action here, because it's about what we can do, but they're kind of indirect ties to action, because it's all about our grip on the world in a way suitable for reasoning and planning. So that's maybe another little element of that story. Yeah, sorry, there's lots of questions. Dave?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of this project of explaining consciousness, or explaining it away by explaining the things we say about consciousness. Of course, so this is sort of the most, if you want to be deflationary about consciousness, this is the most promising strategy to take up, and I like the idea of trying to explain things like the reports and so on in terms of certain kinds of direct access. At the same time, I'm inclined to think that the best way of developing this view is as a form of fairly heavy illusionism about consciousness. We're explaining the judgments or the reports, and we're explaining why we think we have these states without needing to postulate the states themselves in the first place. So it's a way of explaining away the illusion of qualia. In this paper, you go a little bit wishy-washy, which is try to have the story of explaining the reports, but not make it. I mean, Keith characterized you as an illusionist, but actually, one of the things that's interesting here is that you seem to want to have your cake and eat it too by actually explaining the reports and the acts, and then actually having the qualia and seeing this as an explanation. And well, anyway, so around there, I mean, it's in the very title of your paper. The access is going to imply the qualia, not to. And it's that part of the story that struck me as a little bit less argued than the rest of it. So I mean, obviously a primary reaction from any number of your opponents here is going to be that you've told a story about access, and why on earth couldn't you have all that access without the qualia in the first place, at least as a conceptual possibility. To which your response just seems to say to kind of put your foot down and say, no, I say that when you got the access, you got the qualia. If you don't, you're begging the question against me. I mean, at this point, you've got there's just a sort of clash of intuitions. I think a lot of people are going to say that you can straightforwardly imagine the mechanisms of access without the qualia. They might be wrong, but then at that point, it's like, oh, can you say something to help us along a little bit and seeing why that's wrong? I mean, a few prima facie points that might seem to tend in the direction against you. One is, looks like on the face of it, you can imagine all this direct access stuff going on. Pretty simple mechanisms involving cameras and microphones and modalities and access, pretty direct access of a mechanism to information and some modality tags. So, you know, it came from the camera and so on. And most of us are not going to be terribly tempted to think there's experience there. So there's one prima facie gap. Another prima facie gap is the one you concede yourself, the knowledge argument style gap. That seems you can know all the stuff about access without knowing about the specific conscious experiences and so on. It's another way of bringing out the epistemic gap. A third way is the connection to the case you discussed of cases where there seems to be direct access without the corresponding vivid phenomenology, like direct access to belief when we know what we're thinking, and so on, with nothing like this corresponding vivid phenomenology, to which you say, I only mean to be appealing to this special case perception. But that just seems to just target us even harder on the question, what is the special thing in this special case of perceptual access and a big modality specific that suddenly makes it conceptually impossible to think that there's none of the vivid phenomenology there. So in a way, maybe there's some explanatory story you can tell there. So I'd love to hear it. But then it seems to me that's going to be much of the meat lies. But why not just go for the alternative vision, which is, look, I've got a beautiful explanation of the judgments, the qualia, and so on. Who needs it to actually be the qualia?
Well, in a way, that is what I think, because that's why I think take care of the content, and consciousness takes care of itself.
It runs away. Yeah.
I suppose the reason that you think I've got a bit wishy-washy there, and probably you're right, is that it seems to me that you are onto something when you're making these judgments about the qualitative nature of your experience. What you're onto are genuine signatures in the space of actions that you currently know you're able to perform. And so because I think you're actually onto something, that's why I kind of want to say that I'm sort of reconstructing the qualia using these knowledgey resources rather than just getting rid of them. But I agree that it depends what you needed them to be in the first place, whether this is a getting rid of or a content-y reconstruction.
The thing you're onto is at least seems to be a pretty pale shadow of what you originally thought you were.
No, it's the whole thing. Well,
you think it's the thing which exists, but the question is how much of the original conception did it satisfy?
But this is certainly what I want to say is, having a grip on what you're currently able to do on the basis of the informational state that you've got into by trying to predict the sensory barrage as best you can right now is just what conscious experience of the world is, just what qualitative.
It's just how the processing in us is working, let's say. The question is, in what sense does this deserve to be called conscious experience if all this can be done by a little simple device?
Okay, I'll come to that one in a second. But when Mary actually sort of gets to see colours for the first time, I think what happens there is that Mary learns a lot of stuff there and then about her own abilities to sift and sort and do stuff on the basis of that kind of sensory barrage.
She knew all that already. She had her wiring diagram.
Well, no, she did. She knew what sifting and sorting she'd be able to do, but she didn't have a direct non-inferential grip on that suite of possibilities for action. That's kind of what I...
This is a developmental process. I mean, Mary would actually have to learn, and that a child, for that matter, actually learns and that the qualia emerge in the course of its first.
I would guess it would take a bit of learning because, it takes a while for kids to learn how to do this stuff, and that's the position she's in, yeah. So, yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. You know the evidence that little children actually don't know how they know things, and will make mistakes.
Yeah.
How would you find out what colour the ball was? Would you have to smell it or reach for it or whatever? They get it wrong. So that's it. But it's very interesting if there was really to be a good developmental story to be told about how the qualitative space changes.
And Kathleen Akins has some fantastic recent work on learning about colours, which was used to be thought that the problem was learning to associate colour terms with colour experiences, but what I think she manages to show is it's learning to have the colour experiences themselves, which is the developmentally tricky thing, to experience the wall as it were red overall.
Nobody's ever said that about Mary, Mary given a few weeks.
And what do you say about the key difference?
Oh, you were asking about the little mini system that's got the properties.
Actually, that wasn't what I was thinking about. The difference between the belief case and the perception case. We say, this is a special case, and I only insisted in the special case. It implies phenomenology, and that just seemed like a bit about how special pleading.
That argument only worked in that case, a particular little argument I gave, but I think this knowing what you can do extension covers all of the phenomenology. That's the idea. So this is a different paper actually. Ward, Roberts and Clark, 2010 in Santes. It's called Knowing What We Can Do.
What we can do. Yeah. And the idea is in the perceptual case that we know more about what we can do than in the belief case, and that knowledge of action is what grounds the. Okay, I've got to read this paper.
Why does it have to be knowing what we can do rather than just believing what we can do? What if we're wrong about it? What if we see?
Oh yeah, sorry. I use knowing in that sort of way. Yeah.
It's analytical. That's the thing. You have to not only be getting at something, but be getting at But what if you think you're getting at something and there isn't? It isn't there. What if your introspections? It's misleading you about the affordances. Is that seems to be what makes the difference?
Then you'll think you're having qualitative experiences without actually being onto the patterns.
Well, onto the patterns. So there needs to be something there for you to be onto to get the whole story up and running. But what if in particular cases you don't latch onto it correctly? Yeah. This seems to be where the difference between you being an illusionist and being a realist comes in, because the illusionist will say, well, if you think you're onto something, you're onto, that's it. That's all that matters subjectively. But you seem to want to be a realist and say no. In those cases, there's no qualia. You're deluded.
Those are difficult cases, because I have to say that in those cases you will think they're a qualia, you will judge they're a qualia, but you're not actually on to the signatures in the space of actions that are genuinely associated with, for example, having a grip on a sort of some reflectance property of surfaces or something. So they're weird cases. I don't know that I need to actually do anything more than just explain why they're weird and leave it at that.
Well, they're two different explananda, really, aren't they? In one case, you're trying to explain what you're actually tracking there, and in the other case, you're just explaining our reports of how it seems.
Yeah, but look, I mean, part of the way it's useful to see Andy's work is not as a conceptual analysis of our, living, breathing concepts, assume we share them, but it's a scientific project. Mm-hmm. And so you would expect for any scientific project, whether it's in physics or chemistry or neurobiology, that you're going to have some unanswered questions, and also that it may not fit in all respects with prevailing assumptions within this rather arcane corner of academia called philosophy of mind. Yeah. I mean, let's agree that some of the assumptions that philosophers of mind have about access and about the word knowledge and so forth might be things that in the course of time get revised, but it's not conceptual analysis. This is a scientific project. It can be falsified, can be tested, can be augmented, can be changed, and in the end it may be doomed.
I think it's worth, in the paper, Andy says a lot about closing up corners of logical space. He's concerned with matters not just of empirical possibility, but logical possibility with what we can conceive. I think the project is a bit closer to the...
Yeah, the Access Qualia project was a bit like that. It's, it's true. It's true. Yeah, I was trying to do a bit of philosophy there, but I really shouldn't.
Don't. It's a dead end.
I don't know how strongly you meant this from what you said, but I found it problematic in the paper that you say you're explaining what consciousness but not specific states of consciousness, and then you give this analogy to, you might explain why the dam water came out of a dam but not where it went. Okay. But I found a problem with that analogy is in the case of consciousness you're dealing with, unlike that analogy, you're dealing with a determinable and its determinants. And that's like a really close metaphysical relationship, and we tend to think things instantiate a given determinable because they instantiate a determinant of it. Right? So like
Can you speak up a little bit
sorry.
slower?
So translate some of that.
All right. So in the case you're dealing with, unlike the analogy with the dam you give at the end, so the cup is coloured because it's white, right? Things, and analogously, things are conscious because they have a specific state of consciousness. So it'd be really weird if you had a metaphysical theory of what makes the cup what makes the cup coloured, which didn't have immediate implications for what makes it white. And so in this case, it seems to me problematic. Things are coloured because the cup is coloured because it's white, and this seems to be important because if you're gonna take this theory to be explaining the specific kinds of consciousness, then you come up with a strong form of the knowledge problem, right? I mean, if I'm just thinking about consciousness and the zombie stuff, I can almost get in the mindset that this thing has come. But then when you if you asked me if you knew all this stuff and you'd never tasted Marmite, and you knew these relevant facts about someone who had tasted Marmite, would you then know what it's like to taste Marmite? I mean, there's that very strong intuition that you still wouldn't know that. So, yeah. So it seems to me that you ought to be explaining the specific. If the theory works, it ought to explain why we have the specific conscious qualities we do, and then you're going to come.
So I see where you're coming from now with that, and I agree in one way. But in terms of the particular project in the little paper, it was just to show how you could be kind of forced into a corner where you have to say, I know that these cups are different on the basis of my experience of the cups, without being able to actually, as it were, cash it out any further. So I think let me try that again. That didn't come out very well. So I think that the argument there was supposed to say, look, this is one way of beginning to close the gap by showing how we can be forced to make certain kinds of judgments about the puzzling nature of my own experience to myself. Because, as it were, I know that I can do these certain things, sifting, sorting, classifying, but I don't actually know on what basis I'm doing them. Therefore, I end up judging. It's on the basis of my qualitative experience. You're right that if, as it were, there was no way to plug any finer-grained story into that story to give you the details of your qualitative experiences, that would be weird. It would be metaphysically weird, as you say, and we wouldn't be able to imagine the situation we were supposed to be in.
So maybe I was misunderstanding.
But the strategy then is, okay, that gives you the sort of first strike against heavy-duty qualia, and then you come in with the fine machinery and explain how it can work for more detailed stuff, and that's how knowing what we can do, knowing how you're poised over an action space is supposed to do it.
But then it just seems to me that your gap, I guess it depends, as Dave was saying, whether you're an illusionist or you're trying to be a realist about quality, because, I mean, just the plausibility, if it is a gap-closing project, I mean, Patricia seems to be suggesting something more a posteriori, but if you're trying to pursue a priori physicalism, you're trying to close the gap, it kind of seems plausible when you just get the zombie intuition. Yeah, you could kind of persuade people that such a thing would have to be conscious, but then when you bring in the specific kinds of consciousness, I think it, for me it just becomes completely implausible that this kind of information could teach you what it's like to taste Marmite.
You mean just information about what modality the stuff is coming in? Yeah, I agree. That's not going to reconstruct just like, hey, I'm tasting.
That's about someone who has it.
Yeah. But you're all convincing me that really I should just come out and be a proper illusionist. That does sound right in a way, but I think that then, nonetheless, I can say something specific and structured about what it is you're onto when you suffer that illusion, if you like. You're onto patterns in what you can do in your own action space, and that's not nothing. So it's not as if, it's not like, I don't know, it's not like you're not latching onto something.
Can I just say one small thing? So I don't. And then there seems to be two options. Three options. You can be an illusionist, you can go a priori, but then you've got to close gaps. Okay. Or more like Patricia's saying, go more a posteriori and say, well, we're changing the concepts a bit.
So that's it, right.
And you're changing, I think, the idea that the way you structure the problem is correct. Namely, you're either an illusionist or you're a realist. That's got nothing to do. That's not at all, from a scientific point of view, a useful way to make the distinctions. So I think Andy should just say, well, let's look at it from a different angle. And when you look at it from a different angle, there are a whole lot of things that you can explain, some things that you can't, but may be able to in the fullness of time. But if you want to hang with this, either you're a wishy-washy or you're an illusionist or you're a this or you're that, if those labels really kind of do something for you, be my guest.
I'm horrified. From 1981, someone came along this eliminativism about the propositional attitudes versus realism. This is just the wrong way to think of a totally scientifically useless way to think about things.
I agree with that too.
You guys have a lot to answer for.
So maybe what I should be is like
I stand corrected.
What was the Simon Blackburn quasi-realism, quasi-realism? Maybe I should be a quasi-illusionist on the boat. It would be good.
I don't think it's doing us any good.
So we got a couple, and Alexa, and then
I just wanted to ask a little question on data's ground, because I'm not sure I fully understand what an illusionist or a realist is, but if you're looking at it from a predictive coding point of view, is there a difference?
I'll come to that in my comments on Dennett.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering whether part of the problem is that your whole perspective sort of undermines that kind of distinction.
Absolutely.
And whereas people are saying you've got to be one or the other.
I think you're right. It sort of does. It's all just kind of latent variables, I think, all the way down.
What does seem right is that the illusionism is, I mean, there's obviously going to be a sliding scale from revisionism to illusionism. In the paper, the revisionism wasn't even there. So I think whether you're an illusionist or a heavy-duty revisionist, we can argue about that. But I think you do think you've got to come out and at least embrace some pretty serious revisionism.
Okay, yeah, I'm on with that. Yeah.
I don't clarify the difference between your position on introspection and the position of Paul.
Oh, my position, Paul's on introspection. That would require me knowing Paul's position on introspection. Paul?
What is it you want me to...
So the difference between, well, my position on introspection is just something like we are aware of the possibilities for action that the sensory barrage is currently making available to us. So when I introspect, I think typically what I introspect is something about that. Sometimes I introspect other things like, I don't know, stuff about my own body, and I think there's a structurally similar, but with a different kind of prediction in play account to give of that. But on the whole, I think if I introspect about my experience, what I'm introspecting about is, what's being presented to me and what I could do with it. So that's kind of how I think about introspection, and I don't know how Paul thinks about it offhand.
So is it an aim setting? Is it aim setting? Or what does it mean? What can I do with it?
Yes, it's about, as it were, what you know about the kinds of things that you could now do. So it's very, very closely linked to being in a position to plan and to reason and to answer questions about and to justify your actions. So I can say, why did this action succeed? Because I saw the knife in front of me. I saw where it was located in visual space. When I do this, I know that I can perform those kinds of actions. And that's perhaps actually rather different to when I'm running through a forest and I'm actually able to rapidly avoid banging into things. Because under those conditions, I don't think the information that I'm being driven by gets poised for use in reason and planning in that way, and that might explain why I don't seem to need to be conscious of that information in order to use it successfully. So I think that what introspection typically reveals for me is something about this kind of slower time scale, closer to being engaged for planning and reasoning stuff, which seems, not entirely kind of evolutionarily implausible to me as an outcome. But
I can't see Dan's had his hand up.
oh, sorry, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
This in a way is almost a question for Keith, but it's for both of you. Keith at one point said, it's not just a judgment, it's a judgment that's grounded somehow.
Yeah.
And I thought, that is certainly the sort of traditional way of thinking about it, and I think it's one of those inversions. It's just backwards. It's not so much that our judgments are grounded in qualia, as that qualia are the artifacts of our judgments in the following sense. It's not that qualia are real qualia, it's that our judgments, as you say, are to some extent, as we're anticipatory. They are putting us in touch with what we can do next, or what we can think next, or what we expect to be able to do next. And in a case where we misjudge, we think we're seeing when in fact we're hearing. Our misjudgment is not that we're mistaking one quale, a visual quale, for an auditory quale, as that we are expecting. We are in a mode of expectation that, as it were, if we blinked, this would have an effect on our performance when it wouldn't. Or if we put on earmuffs, we would not expect it to affect our behavior, but it does. And so the grounding is not something which is prior. The way we convince ourselves that we're really seeing is by probing ourselves to see, well, can I do the next thing that vision would, if I'm seeing, then I ought to be able to do this. Now, arguments of little conditional, we almost never spell them out, articulate them, verbalize them to ourselves. But I think human thinking is shot through with sort of micro-probing of this sort. My favorite example of this is, everybody, I want you to answer this question. Have you ever danced with a movie star? You know the answer. I think the answer in probably every case is no. Is there somebody who says no?
No.
All right, so, but now think. I'm sure you didn't introspect this, but your capacity to answer that question immediately is not because you have, among the facts you have stored in your belief bank is, I have never danced with a movie star. It's that when the question went into your ears and you understood it, if you'd ever danced with a movie star, you would be expecting to be flooded with a recollection at this point. Nothing's coming to mind, and so you infer from that, no. You're very confident, you don't have any sense that this is an inference, but it's an inference which actually depends not only on the fact that nothing comes back, but on your using your own self-knowledge. I am the sort of person, if I ever had danced with a movie star, I would have a memory. If I had asked him instead the question, have you ever driven for 5 miles behind a green Chevrolet? Right? I don't know. But it would be very weird if you say, gee, I don't know whether I've danced with a movie star. So judgments of this sort seem to be direct, immediate, and they seem to be grounded. But what they're actually grounded in is an expectation and inference about that.
Yes, I agree that an awful lot of, if you like, subpersonal inference is involved when these things kind of well up, and I suppose it's only animals like us that could have some of those experiences, because, you know, I take it, I can't raise an issue like this for my cat. I don't even know how to set it up experimentally.
Could I just add a little code to that? I think it's something I meant to say. The two different versions that you suggested, what it's access to, the vehicles of representation and the skill sets, they're actually very different. And it's a different sort of, because one is sort of retrospective access, and the other is anticipatory.
Yeah, I don't like the vehicle thing. I was just trying to think of some other options.
But it's almost like they're two, you present them as if they're two, I think they're very different theses. It's not like two versions of the same story, they're two completely different stories.
But if there was something like, what was it, specific neural energies, or what was that old thing Mueller or someone had, you know, if there really was something like that, maybe that could play the role. But since there isn't, not good. Yeah, I think, well, Paul's there and then there.
Jesse, too.
And Jesse, oh, I didn't see Jesse there, right. So, have you been there a long time, Jesse?
Yeah.
No, okay, Paul then.
One of the nice things about your proposed account of introspection is that it turns out to be nicely parallel to our view of external perception, perception of the external world. When we emphasize the importance of perceived affordances and opportunities for action and problematic situations that may require dealing with, and so on and so on. You're looking at a very important dimension of our perception of the external world. Now, The suggestion that our perception of the internal world, I'm coming to like the term that scientists used, interoception, as opposed to introspection, because they use interoception to emphasize the parallels between external perception on the one hand and internal perception, and the only difference between the two is supposed to be on which side of the skin the objects of perception are. In one case they're outside, in the other case they're inside. And that parallel leads us to another one, because we find in the external world the objects of extrospection, or perception as we typically call it. We find a subset of the perceivable world to consist of things like colors and tastes and smells, and I'm here talking about external objective things, and they pose a prima facie problem. And the same way I want to suggest, and your account suggests, that internal phenomenal features of our sensations pose a special problem. They're a subset of the things we interocept. I interocept the position of my body and the state of my stomach and the existence of say a pounding heart or excitement. There's all sorts of things that I interocept that don't seem to be philosophically or ontologically problematic or special. There is a special subset, of course, the ones that philosophers have focused on, the phenomenological features of introspected objects, but they have parallels in the external world with the standard perceptual features. And what I want to suggest is that on your account, we shouldn't expect the inside cases, to be any more problematic or ultimately different in any way from the external cases. And we can look at the case of the external objects, like external warmth and external color and so forth, and see the solutions, the genuine solutions we have come up with there, and seek to recreate them in the internal realm. So this, of course, is a policy recommendation, which is, I'm here trying to draw a lesson which is just the opposite lesson than the one, say, David Chalmers wants to draw. And I'm pleased with the account you give because it re-emphasizes the parallels between the internal case and the external case. If the external case is not problematic, then neither is the internal case, I want to suggest.
I agree completely, because interestingly, a lot of the current predictive coding work on consciousness is linking it heavily to interoceptive prediction. That's a big little cottage industry there. So yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So Dirk, and then
I like my second relation, Paul. So there's certain cases like of let's say bodily sensations that aren't directly related to affordances or actions, like headaches, for example. So what do you want to say about headaches?
Headaches, yeah, interoceptive prediction, so revealing to you a kind of structured distal in that sense, a bodily distal realm. So I think a headache's a latent variable in my interoceptive model, if you like, something like that. So I don't think this would just be saying what Paul just said. I don't think they're posing a kind of difference in kind issue. It's just that, in fact, the predictive coding story is maybe at its most plausible in respect of interoception first and foremost, where you can think of it as a kind of version of homeostasis, just kind of, dealing with variation from your anticipated state. But if in order to deal with variation from your anticipated state, you end up inducing a kind of structured model of some of those deviations, I suspect headaches probably turn up somewhere in that structured model.
How to deal with them, how to compensate for them, how to avoid them, how to cure them.
It's interesting that headache is sort of a special case in one regard. If Dirk had asked about, a sore ankle, it would have been obvious. Because there's things to do. There's things to expect not to be able to do. There's all sorts of expectations about what would happen if I stepped on my foot right now. And with headaches, there's not much of that.
Yeah.
So it is sort of a stripped down case.
Jesse.
I'm happy to make time's up.
I don't know what time, must be getting close. Yeah, but if you make it really, really quick, we can.
So I wanted to ask about predictive coding as a paradigm. We talked a little bit about it in the target paper, but
as Keith remarked in his opening, you're loved by many of us in this room as somebody who's been ahead of the curve and a trendsetter, and you were an advocate of connectionism early on and very good at articulating its philosophical significance as a model of the mind. And then when situated robotics came around, you jumped ship a little bit and said, okay, here's the, well, no, I think you have the same, commitments, but you said, okay, here's the next thing. Yeah. And this we need to take on board. And those have been viewed very much as kind of paradigm models, general models of how to think about the mind. And in this paper, you advertise predictive coding as the next thing. So all of us who have always seen you as ahead of the curve are, of course, listening attentively and dutifully and wondering if we need to join you in this move. And you say a fair bit about whether it's a paradigm, whether it's a replacement, whether it's a model, a general model of how the mind works. You do a little bit of backsliding there, not in a bad way, I think in just the right way, by saying it's a pluralistic account. I think it's a sort of single, algorithm, for instance, for how the mind works would be a mistake. It's more a general framework. I want to push the paradigm issue a little bit in the context of your previous trend-setting agenda. So, one way one might resist the paradigm status of predictive coding is by appeal to connectionism, and say, look, everyone who followed that literature knows that the only networks that had any real hope of doing interesting cognitive work were ones that had a predictive component, some sort of predictive component. So to that extent, predictive coding is not a general model of how the mind works. It's only built into connectionism. But so is a lot more, so some of it, but you might say, equally heavy in learning or something should be part of the paradigm. So why emphasize one of the things that these networks do over and above these other things? Just take on the whole connectionist framework, which is richer, and it has some of this predictive coding in, and then as we develop that theory of connectionism and try and find best cognitive models of connectionism, we get into the specifics, and if specific, say, Bayesian aspects of prediction become an important part of that, that's just a development of connections theory. Now, on the robotics side, you might say, well, one of the things we learned from robotics is that we didn't need to do nearly as much representing as we thought. And indeed, predictive coding, it might be true of us in a certain way that we make heavy use of memory, but it was exactly the insight of the kind of Brooksian MIT neo-robotics movement that you could get by with no memory at all. And we get these extra bells and whistles, and it might be true that sort of certain extremes of human cognitive achievement are facilitated by this add-on, this extra little sort of cognitive machine that gives us the predictive capacity. But it's nothing more than that. The heart of it is actually precisely the stuff that precedes the introduction of predictive capacity. So having your previous paradigms in a certain way render this one both non-paradigmatic and to a certain extent moot.
Yes. No.
Okay.
So the reason I like this paradigm is that I think I can have all the best bits of the previous paradigms plus a kind of structured grip on what's out there, and a structured sort of grip in a way that would almost satisfy Fodor. Something like this, that actually we do justice both to, if you like, the best connectionist models of learning. After all, most of the predictive coding paradigm is roughly coming out of the Hinton developments of connectionism, the kind of Boltzmann machine and Helmholtz machine, more importantly, side of that. So the kind of thought is that really, by doing connectionism in this way, you get the best of many worlds. I do agree with you that actually, as soon as you start thinking about implementing these stories, you're basically thinking within a connectionist framework. I still recognize it that way. I think attempts to pit these against each other, like there was a little exchange in Trends in Cog Sci, something like emergent connectionism versus Bayesian probabilistic inference. Well, I think as soon as you look at the kind of implementation of Bayesian probabilistic inference that predictive coding offers, then you see that that's a false conflict. There's no such conflict. This is the same thing. The other question that you're raising, though, so I just want to say, yeah, I agree with you. It's a good bit of connectionism. There's a very important bit, this idea of, as it were, trying to trying to predict the current signal from the top down as a kind of driver for learning across multiple scales of space and time. It's really powerful. I mean, Hinton's sort of benchmark results in handwritten digit recognition and so on all have this sort of flavor. The other issue is harder, and it's the issue in the book, the Surfing Uncertainty book that Keith kindly mentioned. And that's how to bring this together with the insight that basically we're going to use the most minimal model that we can at any given moment. I think there's a kind of technical trick there that does the work. And the technical trick is just learning multiple different strategies for predicting the sensory barrage and estimating which of those strategies yields the least uncertainty at the moment with respect to the task that I'm trying to perform. And so you kind of contextualize by task. You use a kind of meta-Bayesian strategy for selecting what strategy to use. And at that point, you may very well select a really quick and dirty, simple, minimal model. For example, running to catch the fly ball in baseball, where, you do something that is just sort of updated moment by running in a way to keep the optical acceleration of the ball constant while you're running. So those sorts of solutions, I think, are simply now they emerge as part of a systematic framework that lets us moment by moment, if you like, mix more and less representational or heavy-duty solutions together as sort of task and circumstance dictate. So the bit of the apparatus that Keith mentioned that I won't even try to properly introduce, but the stuff about precision weighting is the tool for doing that. So as it were, changing the impact of prediction error in different neural populations and different bits of the hierarchy according to context. That's an extra kind of trick that does an awful lot of work in these frameworks. So I think what I want to say is I want to have all my paradigms and eat them at this point.
So just a quick follow-up on that. I like that answer very much. No. But then I want to suggest, maybe that this idea of trying to satisfy Fodor is exactly the wrong thing to be doing. And in fact, I know you didn't mean it, but so just doing a bit more Andy history. Yeah. You were not only always the radical, you were always the conservative. Because what you did with connectionism is you said, this is super important and exciting, but we don't need to get rid of representation because we can use Dinetian tricks to get representation in there. And likewise with dynamical system, you always kept it relatively classical. And while by being very radical and still showing that it doesn't require total departure from what we thought was involved, I think the new view, even though it looks very conventional on the face of it, prediction after all is naturally thought of in representational terms, is actually as spelled out in the BBS paper and in your remark just now, quite different from how we thought about representation. Precisely because there isn't this bit of world tracking. Your opening reply to Keith and a lot of how you set things up is trying to reconstruct the world as it is. But it's not that. It's a dynamic creation of the world through activity. But I think once you're there, then you're so far away from the representation paradigm because it's no longer tracking as the primary goal of cognition, but somehow creating.
I think that's right, and that is what I'm trying to do in the Surfing Uncertainty book. I don't think I got quite the right vocabularies to talk about it properly yet, but one of the things that comes out of this sort of framework is that the sort of distinction between sensory and motor processing becomes very, very marginal. It's just different kinds of things that you're predicting, and all of our high-level predictions have kind of motoric implications built into them here. So you move around in the world in ways that will bring back the high-quality information that you predict to be available.
You also break down belief and desire in the paper, so this believing and desiring as dichotomous, as opposed to the desire always being part of the construction of the world, is, I think, a really interesting break from tradition.
So finding the right way to talk about that stuff, I think, would be the right way to go, and at that point it will hopefully look a bit more radical than it currently does. Yeah.
I think
we must stop.
This is probably a good time to stop, and let me make a suggestion. It's 11 o'clock now. We're scheduled for 12:30 lunch, but I think we want a break now.